Thanks, Martin. So we have interviewed quite a few people, in the initiative of GESDA and asked them where they think things might be going. So let me just say maybe a few words what we have gathered. We all have seen, of course, a flurry of articles, exciting results, advances of AI and machine learning. And, we know that neural networks help design machines play better Go and chess than humans do. We have seen impressive advances in some scientific challenges like protein folding, etc. We have seen remarkable progress in natural language processing. Machine learning systems can write better code or very good code just given some natural language inputs, etc. So the question is what might lying ahead. So here is maybe a short perspective. If we're thinking of the next 5 years, it might be exciting progress, but probably more of the same in sense of there will be increased performance gains, but probably based on the same models we have right now, but simply driven by increased access to data and exponentially increasing computing powers. We'll probably also see some emergence of ethical and regulatory framework. And what will this give us? Well, it will give us things that we probably already have heard, but just much better. Autonomous vehicles, robots that can work in conjunction with humans side by side in a safe environment, etc. But it might not be, so surprising given that what we've heard. But I think in a 10-year horizons, we will see things that we don't have right now. And this will be based on hopefully the ability to learn from few examples rather than the systems that we have right now that learn based off massive data sets. The ability to transfer knowledge across similar tasks that are similar, but not identical. Again, something that is currently right now just on the edge what can be done. The ability to incorporate prior knowledge and logical reasoning, again, something that systems currently are not particularly good at. The ability to certify and explain outcomes. So not just giving my best effort outcome that given an input, but explain how we derived at that. And the ability to deal with potentially biased and partially erroneous data, as well as the ability to be more resilient to attacks. And these are all currently on the horizon or burning research questions that I hope in the next 10 years will make significant progress. And what will this make possible? Well, will make possible to attack what's called the long tail of small problems. So where machine learning will be able to incorporate much more in a flexible and human-like manner than what is possible right now. And it will vastly increase opportunities for human-machine collaborations and interaction, and making machine learning significantly more pervasive in our everyday life. Now, what could be one potential application? Of course, there's pretty much any area you look at, but just think of healthcare, diagnostics, treatments, preventions of errors, but maybe also the care itself if you're thinking of robots. And if you're thinking further ahead, maybe 25 years, this is more, of course, a little bit more science fiction than currently, but we could see on the horizon potentially brain-machine interfaces, becoming reality. This could, of course, be used for therapeutic settings, but potentially could also be used, of course, for human augmentation. But it could not just be for therapeutic settings, but it could also lead to an interplay with neuroscience, not just augmenting humans or treating them, but maybe also learn more about the brain by exactly interfacing and learning. So learning from the brain, but potentially also augmenting the brain. And we could see a convergence with another very important, scientific development, that's quantum. So we could see quantum machining. That's not just putting two buzzwords together. Quantum has some inherent, characteristics that make it possible to attack problems that otherwise we can't. So this is not just attacking very complex problems, but quantum might also be able to attack problems of trust. So think of, for example, computations. We don't just want that a computation is done. We also want to verify that the computation that was promised to us is the computation that was done. That's something that's very difficult to verify that in a classical setting, but it's possible in a quantum setting. And if we achieve all these advances, then it might also be possible that machine learning in the next 25 years doesn't just help us in everyday tasks, but it might help us also in a scientific setting to come up with scientific breakthroughs, not just in the way that's done right now by crunching huge amounts of data and finding pattern in there, but much more in a human-like way, reasoning about things, coming up with fundamental new discoveries rather than just, crunching through data and finding patterns that way. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you, Rüdiger, to set the scene about a couple of trends on what might be on the horizon. I would like maybe now to move to Muthoni. I think you heard Rüdiger introduce a couple of ideas that could sound a bit like science fictions, human-machine collaboration, machine learning that would be able to do everyday tasks beyond, the deep learning methods that we use today. I think you are working on the ground, you develop companies, you interact with the civil society, you train people into data science. How does its vision resonate with your perspective and the work that you're conducting on the ground? And which impact it could have, in modifying this ecosystem you're involved in?
Thank you, Martin. I think it's interesting to just follow the conversation that Rüdiger has started, because some of the things he's mentioning may sound very science fiction-y, but now looking at the data that we are collecting just by all of us being able to have access to mobile devices, that means the gaps that were initially there in terms of data sets slowly being filled in. And that means we can be able to use machine learning for everyday tasks. So in terms of the impact on everyday life, I would mention maybe 2 or 3 examples. So the first being a lot of process optimization in everyday tasks. So if you think about commutes and the solutions that are there in terms of routing and being able to give time estimates, cost estimates for ride-sharing apps, for movement mapping. That means we are easily being able to optimize processes that initially would have taken a very long time. Now you can easily live in any city with just access to Google Maps, and you don't necessarily need to know street from street, because your phone is able to sort of use the information of where you are to geolocate wherever it is that you want to go. So I think we've seen a lot of process optimization, but that's the one thing where initially, we think in an African context, it's not going to be adapted very easily, but now you find riders on borders using maps to be able to do deliveries across the city, across the country, which I think is a really great way of implementation. The other thing I've seen being used a lot is in finance, where before a lot of the informal businesses were largely unbanked, but now because most of the transactions are being done through mobile money, it means that the telcos have access to huge databases of how people transact financially. And one interesting example that I heard about recently was, a company looking through their data and wondering why at 3 a.m. they have a rise in the number of people trying to access credit services. And when they dug deeper into the data, they realized these are women or just people who sell in the market, and they are able to access this credit service to be able to buy goods. And then later in the day, they're able to pay for this credit service. So a lot of application in finance for credit scoring in examples that are not being used in larger institutions, but through your phone, you're able to access credit services depending on how much you're transacting daily. And I think lastly, the example I would give would be in healthcare. In the morning, I listened to an InstaDeep session where Karim was talking about the advances in protein design, but also on a much lower scale. I think we've seen a lot of data analysis and use of machine learning in even just trying to understand the COVID-19 pandemic, the trends, being able to ensure sure like vaccination can reach as many people as possible. So I think in terms of the impact in everyday life, we are slowly seeing the penetration of very practical use of machine learning. And yeah, I would say these are interesting times where we are trying to make sense of the data that we are collecting in a larger scale to improve our day-to-day lives.
Thank you, Musoni. If I can just quickly react on that and ask a follow-up question. I think what's interesting compared to the vision of Rüdiger is that we really focus on the disruptiveness of the new applications that are coming, touching healthcare, finance, and everyday tasks. In your perspective, if you see, what's on the horizon, if you see how people are interacting with the technologies, how data sets are being collected and taken care of, do you expect a third wave of disruption on the horizon? Do you expect more changes to come, which would have a profound impact, I guess, on the society we are working in, and maybe different than what we are used to see in Western societies, where some of the tools and the problems are not the same? I don't know if you want to react to that, Mutoni, and think also about some of the applications that could also then come in the coming years that will have an impact on society.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about the potential of machine learning or AI, for me, it boils down to four things: to data, to compute and storage, to expertise, and to the models and the algorithms that we create. And there's an increase in all that. There's an increase in the data being collected. There's an increase in expertise or growth in expertise in terms of being able to build models, to generate models, to understand the data. So yeah, I think the future has a lot of potential for us having machine learning models and AI systems implemented in more practical ways. But one thing that I think is key to note or has been an interesting development is just the focus on human-centered design in creating AI products, where we are not just now thinking about the accuracy of the model, but we're also looking at issues around bias, issues around being able to explain what the models are doing. So I think as we progress, then these are potential or spaces for opportunities.
Thank you, Muthoni. And this gives me a good bridge to Fabrice, actually. I think some of the themes that are put on the table, both on the advances from a scientific or engineering point of view and the issues raised by Muthoni on data access, on bias, trust, on how those technologies are being implemented in a given society. Maybe you could also react and comment on that. Given your perspective from the Red Cross, where you also try to use or to deploy those technologies in fragile contexts for the common good. What experiences do you see in the ground, and how do you see the situation evolving there?
When the ICRC conducts humanitarian actions, they want to provide assistance and protection to people affected by conflicts or situation of violence. And this has to be done in a way that ensures that there is no discrimination in terms of the reason for the violence, the origin of the people. And that's a very key principle of the ICRC actions. And when we use or when we try to apply digital technologies, those principles are here and are especially important. And it takes multiple forms. It's part of it starts with the data collection. So what data are we using? Is it inclusive? Is there a question of consent also? But also clearly the algorithms that are being used. Do we have control on it? Is there some transparency of the criteria that are being used? And I would say the system as a whole in terms of safeguarding, or maybe do we have a human control in the system, or do we entirely rely on the decision from the system? And I was really pleased to hear Professor Urbanke comment about the upcoming of algorithms that have some logical reasoning in it to be able to maybe stop decision or stop actions that looks irrational or not adequate. And all this, so ICRC needs to have this frame to make sure that we don't add digital risk or digital harm to the people affected by violence, and that will remain capable of working on totally independent and impartial way, even though we bring algorithm in the loop. In terms of usages, I don't have an exhaustive list to bring, and it would not be interesting, but I think that the applications that we have for algorithm are quite diverse, and it starts with sometimes need assessment. So it could be a satellite imagery analysis to make population estimates and to be able to coordinate an answer to a crisis. But there are other type of usage, and one is the detection of misinformation or disinformation on social media, to be able to stop the spreading of fake or maybe sometimes hate speeches. And also algorithms we are using for the identification of missing person and be able to reunite families that have been separated by conflicts. But in any situation, we need to make sure that we are not adding bias, or we are not adding exclusion in our activities or actions. And in terms of machine learning, I think one of the biggest criteria is that there is a digital exclusion. So we cannot bring a critical service to the population if people who are excluded from connectivity, for instance, cannot access it. That's always something that we have to put into consideration. And also this notion of making sure that no specific type of population is excluded by the algorithm. Maybe one example I could give is that we are testing and evaluating and using algorithm to evaluate population, and it relies on identifying the building footprint, and we see that it's highly cultural. So depending of the type of constructions, how the village or the cities are organized, the algorithm will be quite performant or inefficient to detect the footprint. And this has a cultural aspect. So there are areas or culture where the prediction is good, and there are areas where it is bad. And we have to make sure that we are not bringing, I would say, systematic bias towards some type of target population or people in need.
Thank you, Fabrice. I think you have put quite some interesting themes on the map where we would further explore during this discussion. Of course, we touched upon bias, but you came with the word digital exclusion, understanding the cultures while we deploy those algorithms, misinformation, and some of the risk associated with it. I would like now maybe to give the floor to Nigeria as well. I think you bring here also your experience of being part of different forums and discussion settings where the policy and the implication on society of some of the technologies we're talking about are being discussed. I think you have heard now a snapshot of perspectives. I think all a bit different with different consequences. But if you think from a governance or a social implication perspective, where do we really need to set the focus at, and what are the big dangers or opportunities that you would see in advances around AI, particularly in Africa?
Thank you, Martin. I would start by saying for the international community, it's imperative to always remember that the technical is geopolitical. The discussions, deliberations, and the decisions on the governance of these technologies at global level must go beyond what we typically see today, which is deterministic and solutionistic, overhyping or overplaying the role of the technologies themselves. And they need to be grounded in this diverse and disparate and complex realities, some of which we've just heard about here, on how there's a reciprocal nature of how technologies impact society and how societies in turn impact the technologies. And this is the same with international relations. And this is really, really critical for the institutions that are concerning themselves with both the governing of technologies, but also how they employ technologies for governance. Taking Fabrice's excellent example about, say a housing commission, whether it's at a local or global level, if a bias is introduced at any point where it sees a hat and imagines that is an indicator of poverty, you can imagine how further down the line that could impact any anything from allocation of resources or just an assumption of who's there and what their reality is. It could be an ecolodge for all we know. Context matters so much in that regard. And ecolodges are becoming the rage, as Modoni would know. So that's just to show that there's a complexity there that we really need to bake into our governance discussions. Another related element to that is that there's an imperative and a very urgent one too, to ensure that the deliberations that we take on at what we call a global or international level are representative and inclusive of the globe. And this is to include even and especially those who are not necessarily the creators of these tools, but who will be impacted by their development and their deployment. We still have too many forums claiming to be global and international in outlook, yet the contexts that are represented are predominantly Western. And this is a huge risk, as it were, in skewing the global perspective on both opportunities and risks that these new technologies bring. Unfortunately, a lot of this is also building on the traditional trajectory of what we call the international order, where there are certain regions that have been sort of considered, we've had the language of first, third world, those who are considered afterthoughts and those who are considered the center. And in an age where technologies are diffusing so rapidly, we cannot afford to think of the governance of these technologies based on how they are rolled out in, say, the West versus the rest. And additionally, we need to have governance institutions, whether they're purely in the scientific side or whether they're in the more diplomatic, international relations-oriented side, taking a lateral and cross-sectoral view. We absolutely must have scientists speaking with anthropologists, speaking with ethnographers, speaking with the coders, everybody who's involved, because to get the context of a particular people, it's not going to just take the villager from there or the scientist who's from Stanford. Everyone in between who's involved in different ways has a perspective we may miss out on. And this is so critical when we say we want to ensure that we're weeding out bias, right? Because we may introduce it by excluding those who should be in the discussion and not necessarily because we were evil or malign actors. So if that's how we expect it at sort of like the application level, we absolutely must require it at the governance level, especially as we set the rules of the road. Now, specifically on Africa, we absolutely need the international community to go beyond thinking and using the continent as a footnote and as its guinea pigs for experiments on, especially there's a perverse habit now I'm seeing with a lot of machine learning AI tools tested out on children, on communities that you can tell have not had given informed consent. And this is building on age-old problematics of how the continent has been exploited. Now, there's a new trend that we must be very wary of, which is the data extractivism that, you know, Africa and other regions of the world that are not considered the center have a diversity to bring to data sets. So that is very attractive for a lot of people who will approach it in that manner. But these are people's lives, these are people's bodies, and these are people's realities that we're encoding into zeros and ones. So we need meaningful, respectful, and inclusive engagement of people. We need to see African scholars, our communities and our governments being involved in these conversations, not just being mentioned in passing in statements and you know, one representative for an entire continent in a global forum is not something that should fly anymore. So the long and short of what I'm saying is what we expect as much of the coders and then the technical community is exactly what we need to see in the community. Because while a machine learning application may apply in a specific education context in the West, for example, does not mean it will translate automatically to the rest. So these are some of the opportunities that and risks, I don't like to usually separate them anymore, that we must keep in mind because it's a delicate balance and tension every step of the way.
Well, thank you, Nigeria. I think you have put many points on the map here that we would need to discuss together. I've written a few keywords: data extraction, inclusiveness, intersectoriality, bringing the people together. The fact that the discussion needs to happen, locally as well and be connected at all levels between all the different people involved in that. And I think that's again a fantastic introduction to Alexandre Fasel, who working on an interface between science and diplomacy. Coming from a diplomatic and governance perspectives, how would you react to some of the statements done by Nigeria? How can we set up these discussion channels to make sure that we can then design and deploy the tools that would be used truly for the common good? I think you're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, there I go. I'm sorry. Thank you, Martin. Can I start by seconding what Nigeria has said as a challenge, and that shows how we need to approach those elements from different angles. And then also accept and realize what strange beast the international community is. It is multifaceted, the actors have different agendas, and the community comes together in different configurations, which then in itself is a driver of silos and solutions or conversations who may be multifaceted or representative, but just in one sector. On the other hand, it is true that there is a cross-fertilization amongst the conversations that are taking place in the international community. I mean, the name of the game is that it is a slow process of building convergence, of making consensus or a common sense of purpose emerging from multiple conversations all around the world in different configurations and different channels. So how then do you bring that together? One point I have as a matter of thinking, it rarely can be done in an abstract and general conversations. You build convergence and consensus when you are working on concrete problems which you try to lead together to practical solutions. And in doing so, you are building what I call in French un espace de vécu commun, so a space of common experience, which then can be grown. But so starting from that consideration, my government and the authorities of Geneva have indeed founded GESDA, the Geneva Science and Diplomacy Anticipator you referred to, Martin, and which you are part of. And the idea there is to anticipate, as we have done today with our discussion, to anticipate what science and technology is bringing upon the international community and humanity at large, and then in a conversation understand what that means and understand what kind of solutions one should imagine, and then try to realize them in a translation phase. And so this process of understanding, or what we call acceleration of solutions, must be done precisely in an inclusive manner, as Nigeria described. And the approach GESDA is now proposing is to bring together into that conversation many different communities. So, of course, from all parts of the world, respecting all the aspects and benefiting from all the different aspects of diversity, but also representing 4 pillars of the global conversation, which is one that comes from science, one that comes from the diplomatic and political galaxy, one that comes from business and philanthropy, the money men, and then the civil society and indeed citizens that need to be involved, and which you can involve now through digital and technological means directly into the conversation. A challenge I think we have is that when we bring together those communities to have those conversations, is that the starting points are not the same. The scientists will come from an anticipatory way and will tell us what is going to happen, possibly. And the operators of the international systems, or the head of agencies, who then must act upon the reality in the world and drive solutions, they are coming from the aspect of the immediate and concrete challenge they need to solve in discharging the mission. So if I take the example from the ICRC, it is good to know that human augmentation is just around the corner, but it does not help immediately the challenges to tackle the challenges a delegation has in the field. So that is a intrinsic challenge we have in that conversation which we are working on. And I see different possibilities, and we can possibly develop on them later in our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. I think you have put brilliantly what GESDA is about and what we try to do by having these conversations. And this conversation today is one of those conversations where we try to bring different actors together at the table to identify the issues that we need to tackle. Lots of elements here again. Maybe I would also now give the possibility to each one of you to react on what has been said. Is there any immediate reactions on one of the talks that you would like to voice?
I might have a question, not a reaction.
Please, Rüdiger.
Okay, so my question would be like this. So clearly, I believe that somehow GESDA has a mission and has a role to play in many. But we have, of course, heard many of the issues that also come in trying to, dictate. GERA has started with that, and then we have heard many echoes from Fabrice and Alexandra and so on. So the question to me is, what exactly could actually be the role of GESDA being here? Because many of the things we have heard is, these systems should be inclusive, should be, all these things, I think we all agree. To me, though, as a scientist, the reality is that many of these things are not driven, of course, top down, right? I mean, they're driven, scientists come up with a new app or, someone tries to make money and then they create a web page or this and that. And regulators and also international communities, we kind of always running, of course, after that, right? And we're trying then afterwards, trying to either enhance things where we see it's good or trying to prevent things where we think these are bad developments. And most of it is really driven, as far as I can see, by either technology or money that's to be made or, whatever it is, and not by top-down regulators, governments, diplomats. So the question is, what can actually be done, to come up with the outcome that we think? What is realistic that we think we can achieve, and how might we go about? And I always prefer things that are very concrete, as we have also heard right now, rather than general principles. So I would be interested to hear your perspective.
Is that the question to me?
I have a reaction.
Or does anybody want to respond to that?
I have a reaction.
Please, Najera.
Rüdiger, I'll say, it's funny. The top-down element doesn't just come from states and regulation anymore. Just because we're living in an environment where science and advances specifically in AI are being driven by corporate interests. So there's an element of a top-downism there in a power dynamic that is worth considering. Or maybe for those of us who are more on the diplomacy side or the ethnographic side of things, we see it that way. So that's one area to accommodate. If there are corporate interests driving the development of certain tools, you could almost end up with the solutionism I was talking about, where somebody has invested so much resource in thinking that this machine learning application will be the fix for the pandemic, and pushes that down, shoves it in a creative way through lobbying or through, in the developmental sense here in Africa, it will sort of be almost like the only way we'll get access to vaccines kind of thing. That's the reality of the messiness on how power dynamics affect even science. And it's an area to keep an eye out for. Actually really empathize with scholars, African scholars in different fields, and particularly in science, because their work, whether it's from the research and development funding they get or lack of it thereof, is so driven by external forces. I feel like sometimes it's probably screaming into a void that we also want to contextualize this work, even if it's a tool developed in Bern or somewhere, and they want to contextualize it for Nairobi. There are so many barriers that create that top-downism. So even when we bring it back purely to the scientific community, now that has reasons that emerge from the political just as much as maybe to some extent the scientific, which complicate how we should frame the problem before we even say we're looking for solutions. So I think a way of complicating how we approach these, understanding what we're trying to work towards, how we got here, what are we trying to apply as a solution, and how to get an output is one important step instead of what I see as the prevailing way, which is a hurry up and wait, which both I would call loosely the scientific and the diplomatic communities have not done a good job, and especially on this side of things. So there's sometimes even the solution, and these days I like to say the solution is also complicating our understanding and our framing before we jump ahead and move to apply stuff.
Thank you, Nanjira. I think other people wanted to react to Rudiger's question. I think, Alexandre, I give the floor to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Quickly, Rudiger, when you say what can be achieved, and please tell me concretely, that's a bit as if you ask, explain the world and give 2 examples. That's rather complicated. And in that spirit, I'm sometimes irritated by the expectation our leaders have, or we all have, in terms of effectiveness and impact and focus, and it must produce results immediately. I mean, in a situation where, the world is complex, as we have just discussed, and organizing it, grasping first, what it is, what the problems really are, what the solutions could be, is of such a complexity that all exercises around that are inefficient. They may be in the long run effective, but they are inefficient. And I'm not bothered with that. Human relations are inefficient. Love is inefficient. So we must accept and support that element. And so we, scientists and diplomats and politicians and citizens and everybody alike, must make that effort to have patience and to keep at it and keep going and not turn away when processes do not create results immediately or sufficiently, where it is sufficiently clear what the results will be. Now, to respond to the role of GESDA, our ambition is, from the Swiss side, is to create a space where this conversation can take place and can be furthered and can be made ever more nuanced, knowledgeable, so that it can then be used to good effect in the traditional challenge of international governance. So the idea is to have conversation of the GESDA type as long as possible before the conversation is being taken over by what you describe as top-down, or which then are government agendas and corporate interests.
Thank you, Alexandre. I have noted down one sentence, which is "love is inefficient." I think I will bring that back to me and to my wife later. I will see what she thinks about that. But going back to this idea of GESDA being one convener, one of the neutral space where these conversations can happen without having any a priori, and trying to move away from the top-down forces that try to shape, or that are shaping, science and technology in one direction. I would like maybe now also to give the floor back to Muthoni on some of the things that have been said, maybe not on the role of GESDA, but maybe on a couple of elements that were mentioned on how the ground responds to those technological forces. When you interact with your peers in Nairobi, when you work on solutions, technology is going so fast, but still there's all these issues that you need to address. What happens to the data that's being used and stored? How can you avoid bias? How can you make sure that you create the space to have this conversation locally? And then the second question is, how can we then that channel back to other kind of discussions, so that the risk that Nanjira mentioned, that things are brought down from elsewhere on in local settings, is not happening so strongly?
Thank you. I think One thing that I feel is important and has been because of my experiences in this space is just an understanding that sometimes we set out to do our best work. So you could set out to do the best in the computer vision space, and things arise from that. So you are using a certain kind of data set and you're trying to build a self-driving car that is able to identify people on the street. And this car has not seen certain kinds of people in the process of training. So the car runs a child over because children were not part of the training set, or runs old people over because it was not part of a training set, and it doesn't identify this as something that the system should consider. So when these issues arise, I think as a community of people working in the space, we shouldn't focus more on now making this a this versus them conversation, but more on, the fact that we sought out to do meaningful work and to create meaningful experiences for everyone. So how do we solve this instead of, and I feel like a lot of research advances in the AI space eventually become a this versus them when you raise issues about biases, when you raise issues about model efficiencies and how models replicate in other scenarios. But that's not the point. The point is that the world is as diverse and we cannot anticipate the diverse experiences that the models are going to have. Based on my experience, I could assume, like Najira mentioned, that where I see a hat, it means poverty. And that's not it. It could be the most lavish, resort in Bali. And these are things that we need to annotate in our data sets. These are things that we need to be open about. So I think the point about focusing on the errors, focusing on transparency with the algorithms, making sure that things can be explained, and making sure that we incorporate people's feedback. If you create a model that is supposed to be a security system and it's not able to identify certain kinds of people, every once in a while I'll try to access my screen at night and it can't detect my face, but someone else would easily unlock their phone because the training set is able to identify their features under those kinds of lighting environments. And if this is a security feature for my house, that means during the day I can access my house, but in the evening I cannot access my house. It's not a trivial thing. It's a thing that should be taken as feedback and incorporated to improve the models, and not sort of create this versus them situation where it's almost as if a function or the African context is seen as if it's slowing down progress because you're bringing up these issues. So I think in design, and if we are thinking about the opportunities that AI bring to the table as an opportunity for us to create new solutions to challenges that have been there year on, like for millennia, then we have to be open to understand new experiences and to just be open to understand other people and other contexts. Yeah.
Thank you. I think this is really important what you just said about the local context, the local culture, and the fact that development in those technologies that are being so disruptive and so critical really need to take these diversities into account as we move forward. And you need this kind of, I don't know how to call it, conversation space, exchanges. You mentioned top down, but bottom up, yes, in order to these issues to be flagged, to be discussed. And therefore that the technology can then be developed in a way that's beneficial. I think Fabrice, I don't know if you want to react both to the question on Rudiger about how can we now concretely advance those problems, so the big questions, but then also react to the statements that we heard about the importance of the local cultural context, how this could be improved in the future, etc.
Yeah, no, there was many very interesting comments. Maybe I start with that one, and if we want to be a little bit provocative, we can say those algorithms are built mainly by and for young white male people that we see coming out of the Silicon Valley, and as soon as it is tried with different ethnicities or different cultures, it usually starts by failing until it is adapted. So we all have examples of systems using machine learning and not performing as they should, and I hope that it is creating some awareness or common understanding that it's not something magical that we should trust blindly. But one, for me, very important point is that there are side effects that are not directly linked to the system itself, but by the fact that it is in use. And maybe as an example, we have recent news coverage about Taliban seizing biometrics databases. So the system is working fine, but there are very severe side effects due to this usage. And I lost the thread. So sometimes, and data collection and privacy around data is frequently creating issues or putting people at risk or having a side effects. And Mutoni at the beginning talked about mobile money. It's something we are looking at because sometimes we are helping populations that are discriminated. Sometimes they are discriminated by the government. And as soon as you have a digital trace of your interaction with ICRC, you could be at risk. You could be rejected by your community. It's a fact when we provide assistance with people victims of sexual violence, it's very important that privacy is key because sometimes you are rejected by your community if it surfaces, or you can be identified by the government as a member of a specific ethnicity or a specific political movement and be at risk. So the system in itself is fine, but the fact that it is in use is creating risk, and this is something that has to be taken into consideration. Maybe my last example is social media, which is creating risk also in ICRC activities. And the system is performing, so you task a machine learning system to maximize the audience and maximize the revenue generated by the audience. So it works, it's perfect, and companies are doing pretty well thanks to this. But it has side effects, and one, it is amplifying fake information, it is amplifying hate speeches, it is amplifying misinformation. But we could say it's a side effect, but it's not the system in itself that is not performing. So I think that would be my most important key point, is that the system as a whole has growing complexity, and it's becoming more and more obvious with the augmentation of the amount of data that is collected and processed. And all those possible adverse usages have to be taken into consideration.
Going back to your questions about what can we do, how can we make it converge? Did you receive elements of responses to the question? No, what should we do then? How can we drive this forward? Let me bounce your question back to you.
Well, they say patient as an Austrian. I'm Austrian. Okay, so I understand, of course, that there's patience, but I think one issue I see is that technology is moving so fast that I don't think we can necessarily talk until we have all these things figured out, because technology simply moves ahead. It doesn't care and doesn't worry. It doesn't, we can't say, look, you stop, let us figure this out until we know what the best solution is, and then we'll come back to you. So I think there's action that's needed. I don't have a solution, and thanks a lot all for brainstorming and giving me your perspective. But I always like to have some concrete small thing that kind of would give us a foothold and get something started, and then from there grow things out, and then hopefully somehow address bigger problems. So that's just my perspective, but thank you very much for your anyway, for your input.
I hope we helped a bit, Rüdiger. I don't know if this idea of small steps, of starting with concrete things that we could do or that we could reflect upon, while technology is continuing its acceleration course, what will be the most important aspect we should look at now, knowing that we have 5 minutes before we end this session, and this will be maybe the last round for all of you to give your takeaways. Maybe I can start with you, Alex, and go the reverse order as the way we started, and ask you, based on the discussion today, the different viewpoints, risks that we saw, but also the good things, to see how machine learning and those technologies are being picked up in Africa, in Nairobi, for example, and the solutions being created. What could be the small converging steps that you could foresee, so that we are not trying to catch up with the technology, but we at least can try to address some of the issues that have been mentioned?
Thank you. I see clearly the challenge that spaces of convergence, such as GESDA, must in due course produce something concrete in order not to lose the legitimacy. So from what we keep hearing today is that I would propose that in this conversation space, one constructs a convergence and the common understanding of some problems and then works concretely on them. As some sort of pilot project or a concrete work which then can be expanded later, because trust has been instituted by this coming together.
Thank you, Alexandre. Moving to you, Nanjira, your final comments on the discussion that we had today.
I think of the pandemic that we're still living through as a really good prism of thinking about how the world and science and diplomacy can or cannot work together. We've seen the failure of each side on so many fronts. And I think thinking about it from, say, the African perspective creates the example of what could happen, as to Alexandre's point, quite potent. Where were scientists, diplomats in, say, trying to secure vaccines for Africa, or what kinds of technologies eventually work? There's a lot of effort to use AI to sort of do gene sequencing and so on. There's so many different layers around how the science and diplomatic worlds have worked. To answer Rüdiger's question about, do we hurry up and wait? Do we wait and see? Changing the way we work, I think this pandemic has ushered us towards that. So let's also use it as a lesson to learn about what we're saying we want to do going forward.
Thank you, Nanjira. I think this is also very, very true. Many lessons need to be learned from the way we manage the pandemic on all the different areas: governance, deployment of technologies, vaccine supplies. And I think the learnings of that and the lessons for science diplomacy haven't been all taken yet. Fabrice, your final words, maybe also reacting on a question that we received from the audience about data sharing and the consequences that could have, also related to privacy, related to some of the dangers you alluded to. Maybe you could also see, what kind of response we could give to that.
Unfortunately, I don't have a very good or definitive answer. The only thing I can say is that ICRC is especially cautious with data collection and, for instance, around biometrics. It's one example. It's not the only one. So we have always we have never been willing to systematically collect biometric information. Sometimes we use it, but not in a way that is where data is aggregated, because we see the risk much bigger and as the potential benefit. And same question comes around mobile money. So it's much more important. We always try to think about the worst case scenario, and we want to make sure that this worst case is not putting people at risk. And sometimes we decide not to use digital tools or digital technologies because we think that the risks are too big compared to the expected benefit. And maybe more generally, I would say my last word is that from the cases I see about hiccups or failure from machine learning, I think that keeping the human at the center of the decision process today is really key. Machine learning can be a great assistance to maybe help sorting cases, help identifying anomalies, but it should never, we should never trust the system to make the final decision, and always make sure that we understand the criteria, we understand the recommendation, and then we made an informed decision, I would say, with safeguardings.
Thank you, Fabrice. Rüdiger, if I may give the final wrap-up comments to you, if you have something to add or react to the conversation.
No, it was quite interesting for me. I still struggle, I think, with trying to formulate an even more active somehow policy, because I think a lot of things are driven. Let's think, for example, of science, right? We have talked about, the examples where certain machine learning systems, don't recognize, certain faces and so on. And how does this happen, right? It's some researcher somewhere in the area that is excited about writing a paper, has some data set, they don't necessarily bother, bring in the best data set. They just want to publish a paper, right? That's how it works. And they find the first data set they find, they publish a paper, and that's it, right? And so a lot of these things are driven by fairly, there's no maliciousness in there. It's thoughtlessness, but it's simply by very local, not globally optimized things that happen, right? And so the question, and I think this will continue that way, because everyone is self-interested. Someone wants to further their academic career, some company wants to make some money, someone else. That's how a lot of things are driven. So the question to me is, how can one change a little bit dynamic? How can one incentivize people to, to take some other parameters into account? So, it was very interesting discussion. I don't have a particular proposal how to do it, but that's something that I think is still on top of my mind, and I would like to think some more about it.